And the last one that I mentioned is very prominent in all of this, of course, is the Jewish nation. Until the 19th century, the Jewish population, and incidentally this is where the largest concentration of Jews in the world lived, they had been a religious group. They were defined by their religion, practice of Judaism. Their principal language, everyday language, was Yiddish. And yet, in the course of the 19th century, a Jewish national movement took root, called Zionism, which turned the religious group into a consciously national grouping, which today is no longer found, of course, here, but in Israel. Parallel to the creation of these new identities, one also sees the processes of obliteration of the old identity. For example, by physical force, the risings against Russian rule in 1830 or again in 1863, 1864, known as the November Rising and the January Rising from the time they began, these risings to assert, as it were, the old values of old Lithuania were crushed by force, and the political culture of old Lithuania was extirpated. Another aspect of it was the official policy of Russification. I've been given an interesting book called Making Russians, i.e. the official policy of turning these Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians and Jews, the attempt to turn them into Russian speakers and loyal members of the Russian Empire. And of course, along with that went a very systematic campaign to introduce a Russian version of history, which of course negated most of the things that people remember. And one can't avoid the terrible end of this story, i.e. the obliteration of traditions. These territories, the great swathe of territories from the Black Sea to the Baltic, were the scene in the Second World War of what the American historian Timothy Snyder has called the bloodlands, i.e. the genocidal policies of killing people in huge numbers. Most people are aware of the Holocaust, the Nazi policy to wipe out the Jews, but there were other campaigns involving similar numbers of people. And all of them, whether it was the Ukrainian terror famine before the war, or the actions against partisans in Belarus, which killed about a quarter of the population at the hands of the Germans, they all happened in these same territories. This is the territory where the worst horrors of European history in the Second World War all happened. And of course, one of the casualties of those horrors is the legacy of the past. Lastly, I just pose one or two questions. 70 years after the bloodlands, the genocidal experiences of the Second World War, 207 years after the partitions Poland, Lithuania at the end of the 18th century. How should we try to remember it? The first thing, I think, is that we should be sensitive to the plurality of memories. There's no memory, no version of history which is absolutely correct. All the parties, as I mentioned, have views on the past, and all, I think, need to be respected. I tell in my chapter the story of Roman Aftanasi, who illegally collected over 40 years. He wrote 40,000 letters to all the former owners of all the great country houses of the Grand Duchy, and eventually, in 1990, issued an album containing not only the pictorial record of the country houses, palaces of these lands, but also records of dates, ownership, architecture, and so on. But probably the most valuable treasure to be valued are the languages. There was a long period where it seemed that several of the languages of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania would be completely destroyed. And of course, Lithuanian is one of these minority languages which has miraculously survived. Another is Yiddish. Yiddish is no longer spoken here. But when I went to New York a few years ago, I was amazed to be invited to homes where people still speak Yiddish, and it sort of echoes of the distant past which no longer exists. And lastly, and this is the main point of the book, we should try to understand the difference between what is today and what once was. There's a great temptation to think of the past as simply an earlier version of what exists today, i.e. There are English people today, there are our ancestors centuries before who wore funny hats and spoke a slightly odd version of our language. What this story tells us is that the past is not just an early version of the present. It is something which in large degree has vanished, and for that reason should be valued. And I was desperately trying to find my closing quotation, which I should say was misquoted in the Times Literary Supplement, but I was very glad that it came. But it sums up essentially what the book is about in all its chapters. All the nations that ever lived have left their footsteps in the sand. The traces fade with every tide. The echoes grow faint. The images are fractured. The human material is atomized and recycled. But if we know where to look, there is always a remnant, a remainder, an irreducible residue. Thank you very much.